Orca Provoke, a young wanderer of the desert, sensed something unusual in the scorching air. He immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. A stranger, lost in the wasteland, without a guide, was doomed to a slow and agonizing death. Orca nodded to show that the vessel held water, then gently but insistently pushed the life-saving flask toward him.
Orca gave the exhausted stranger water and decided to lead him back to the village, knowing that being left alone in the desert meant certain death. But Chun Myung-hoon stubbornly refused to follow. Convinced the old man would soon change his mind, the boy urged his donkey forward.
Orca decided to teach the stubborn traveler a lesson, and drove his donkey across the dunes. Yet Chun Myung-hoon did not fall behind. He followed at an effortless pace until the boy's confidence slowly gave way to unease. That impossible race made Orca realize for the first time that this was no ordinary wanderer. With his unshakable composure, Chun Myung-hoon seemed like a being from another world, leaving only one question: who the hell was he? Then came a devastating impact that shook the desert and hurled a fountain of sand and dust into the air. Somehow, Chun burst out of the crater alive, his face twisted with either rage or unbearable pain. After the horrific fall, Chun Myung-hoon climbed out of the deep crater, brushed off the sand, and stared in disbelief at the unfamiliar desert. He quickly realized that he was nowhere near where he had expected to be. Refusing to lose heart, the warrior set out to find people and discover what kind of world he had been thrown into. He remembered believing that he had finally reached his destination, only to discover that it had been another mirage. Even the moon above looked alien. When he raised his eyes to the night sky, he found not one familiar moon, but 3. Still, he pressed on, a lone silhouette crossing the endless desert with one goal in mind: survival.
Days gave way to nights, and nights to days, blending into one endless, monotonous journey through the sands. Just as hope began to fade, a faint silhouette appeared on the horizon. The stranger's haggard face bore the marks of old suffering and countless battles. That night, Chun Myung-hoon found Orca training himself to exhaustion beside a monument to his mother. Beneath the boy's fury lay grief and a burning desire for revenge. But the old warrior understood that vengeance alone could never create true strength. It was then that the idea of taking him on as a disciple first took root.
Meanwhile, somewhere in the scorched desert, young Orca Provoke watched Chun Myung-hoon from afar. Beyond them stretched an ocean of sand, concealing dangers without end. Then a colossal werebear appeared, its claws and roar shaking the earth as it challenged every living thing in its path.
Chun Myung-hoon brought the werebear down with a single, precise strike, and finished the monster without effort. During quieter days, the fearsome master taught people the simplest truths of life. Awed by his power, young Orca finally asked to become his disciple. For the boy, it was a chance to change his fate forever.
Chun Myung-hoon saw the determination in Orca's eyes and warned him that the path ahead would bring nothing but pain and tears. The boy accepted anyway, certain he could endure any trial. His confidence did not survive the first lesson. Instead of explanations, the master answered with blows and demanded absolute obedience. During another lesson, Chun Myung-hoon immobilized his disciple with a single touch, then continued beating him while denying him any chance to dodge or defend himself. Orca screamed in pain and demanded an explanation, but the master remained unmoved. The school of the desert taught one simple truth: weakness could cost a man his life.
Instead of encouragement, Orca received another merciless blow, a reminder of his master's relentless discipline. After yet another brutal session, however, he noticed something strange. His body was beginning to change in ways he had never experienced before. Chun reminded him that the path of learning had no end, and that the long road ahead would be even more painful.
The real training proved worse than anything Orca had endured before. Chun Myung-hoon increased the burden day after day, and every new trial surpassed the last. By the time the exhausted disciple was already thinking about death, his master calmly dismissed the ordeal as nothing more than a warm-up. Against the endless backdrop of the desert, Chun Myung-hoon lectured him on the foundations of strength: proper breathing, proper movement, and, surprisingly, proper sleep. A thin cane appeared in the master's hand, harmless at first glance, but capable of crushing force. Without warning, it slammed into Orca and sent him sprawling, while Chun simply ordered him to keep his back straight. Night brought trials of its own. In a stifling room, Orca suffered through insect bites as he desperately searched for a little rest. Even during the most private moments, the young disciple tried to steal a brief taste of carefree mischief, but his master left him baffled with a single remark. Let's say it's because you still haven't understood. Tears of rage and injustice streamed down the disciple's face as he tried to flee, whispering, "This isn't right. Why are you doing this to me?" Chun Myung-hoon's staff came crashing down again, drawing fresh cries of pain and despair. At last, in a burst of agonized realization, the disciple cried out as he understood his mistake. He resumed the posture for breathing practice and braced himself for more punishment. Then, the master's staff suddenly left his hand and carved a swift arc through the air. Given permission to use any means necessary, Orca charged his master with everything he had learned. Chun Myung-hoon evaded him with ease, but for the first time, genuine approval appeared in his eyes. To understand where that determination came from, the story turns back to a council of elders debating the empire's growing threat.
An oasis stretched across the boundless sands, offering cool air and the promise of temporary shelter. Every strike from the master was a harsh lesson, and despite the pain, Orca endured it because he understood its purpose. Each crack of the training staff became more than an exercise. It was a battle against the demon inside him.
Yulian rose again and again after every fall, mastering his body, his weapons, and even an unbroken horse. Watching him, Chun Myung-hoon urged another elder to be stricter, warning that kindness could kill a child in the merciless desert. Yulian heard their laughter from a distance, unaware of the trials they were preparing for him.
Chun Myung-hoon's stare was sharp enough to feel like a threat, and Yulian could not bring himself to look away. At the foot of an enormous cliff, the boy gazed up at the rock in disbelief. Then a deafening crack split the air, and the entire cliff exploded into thousands of fragments.
A cry of terror escaped Yulian, but Chun Myung-hoon stood perfectly still amid the destruction. The master calmly warned him of the danger, while the stunned boy struggled to understand what he had just witnessed. Terrified and overwhelmed, Yulian tried to stop him, realizing how insignificant his own skill was beside such power. Chun Myung-hoon continued the lesson with a storm of precise blows and an impossible display of balance. Defeated, Yulian called it a trick, but the master forced him to face an unpleasant truth. Belittling another person's skill was only a way of excusing his own weakness. That lesson hurt more than any strike. Yulian could not understand how breathing, walking, and sleeping would ever bring him closer to his master's strength. Chun Myung-hoon coldly told him that even 1,000,000 years of training would not make them equals, and the words nearly broke him. Yet instead of punishing him again, the master unexpectedly rested a hand on his head, revealing a trace of care beneath all that cruelty. Yulian scratched his head in confusion as the master turned and told him to follow. There was no praise in Chun Myung-hoon's words, only pointed questions that forced the boy to reconsider what progress truly meant. Yulian stopped and lowered his head beneath the sudden weight of doubt. The next stage of training took them to a forge, where Orca felt the weight of real steel for the first time. Chun Myung-hoon had come to collect a special order, one that would soon transform the boy's training.
The blacksmith brought out the weapon commissioned for the disciple, and Orca could barely contain his excitement. Tribal law forbade giving steel to the uninitiated, but the master had secured an exception by pointing to the boy's punishing training. Among the many blades, Orca's eyes fixed on one colossal sword. Noticing the boy's stare, Chun Myung-hoon calmly asked whether the ancient weapon had captured his heart. With a smile, the master declared that no weapon was beyond him, but that true strength came from within, not from a blade. Exhausted and indignant, Orca could hardly believe his ears. To him, that so-called one-handed sword weighed as much as a mountain.
Chun Myung-hoon lifted the enormous sword with ease and gave Orca one condition. He had to train with it for an entire hour. The boy accepted, but before long he was dragging the impossible weapon through the sand while fleeing a monstrous alligator. When it became clear that no help was coming, he tightened his grip and staked everything on one desperate attack.
The monster opened its jaws, exposing fangs ready to swallow Yulian whole. Victory came at a price. His back gave out, and pain tore through his body. As he screamed about the importance of a strong spine, Orca appeared at the edge of the ravine and coolly asked why anyone should worry about a child like him.
Elsewhere, beneath the enormous moons of a silent sky, a lone warrior waited for dawn in deep contemplation. Through pain and exhaustion, he pushed beyond his limits 100 strikes at a time. Chun Myung-hoon merely smiled and assured his disciple that the pain came from overworking himself with the heavy sword, and that there was no cause for concern. While Yulian's father and master argued over whether the training had become too cruel, a new threat emerged far out in the desert. A gigantic monster burst from the sand, and Venursis, the greatest warrior of the Pareia tribe, stepped forward to meet it. His calm expression said more than words ever could. He had no intention of retreating. The monster broke free of its restraints, leaving one warrior beneath its raised paw. Rescue seemed impossible, but a lightning-fast strike severed the beast's limb an instant before the man would have died. That was Orca's first glimpse of Venursis, a warrior whose mere arrival could transform the outcome of a hunt. The warriors grumbled that this was no time for war, yet the monster hunt raged with a savage, almost desperate intensity. The one-eyed fighter understood that the true cause ran far deeper than the absence of an enemy army. They left behind only silent obelisks, their shadows stretching beneath an endless sky. Far away, the faint ring of metal broke the morning silence and heralded new trials. Among the visitors stood an imperial envoy whose courteous manner and calculating smile promised more than negotiations. They promised a dangerous new game.
A sudden strike from Chun Myung-hoon's staff snapped the boy out of his thoughts and forced him to duck. Every nerve tightened as the tension rose, and danger became the only thing reflected in his eyes. Across from him, a predator answered with a primal stare, ready to attack.
After 3 days of hunting, Orca managed to defeat a young panther, though the victory nearly cost him his life. Chun Myung-hoon removed a glowing magic stone from the beast's body and explained its value. To other nations, such gems were a source of power. To the desert tribes, they were merely rare merchandise. The desert concealed the continent's richest deposits of burning water and gemstones of unmatched quality, making the lethal hunts worthwhile. Chun Myung-hoon encouraged and mocked his disciple in equal measure, explaining how difficult the treasures were to obtain, before ridiculing the boy for taking pride in defeating a mere kitten. With a predatory smile, Chun Myung-hoon offered Orca a chance to test himself in a real ordeal. Loneliness weighed on the chief's son, and his pride crumbled against the desert's brutal reality when something impossible appeared in the distance. The sight was so unbelievable that Orca convinced himself it had to be another mirage. Life in the desert followed its own rules, and the spark struck from stone became a symbol of hope in the merciless darkness. Yet what emerged from behind the rock was far less threatening than expected. Orca seemed to have another kind of offer in mind. To his surprise, the small creature ignored the grumbling, darted forward, and seized the discarded stone. A thoughtful look entered its eyes as the campfire flared brightly. The young warrior refused the challenge, insisting that his strength awakened only in the face of mortal danger. Yulian abruptly changed his tone and invited him to the fire, with exaggerated delight at meeting a fellow tribesman. The newcomer introduced himself as Shubian, explaining that he had not yet earned his true name, though he already imagined it would be a great one. Then the elder noticed Shubian's unusual companion, a small desert fox. Barely hiding his envy, the young man questioned Yulian about where he had found it and how he had tamed it. Somewhere nearby, the master silently wondered how the boys would fare in a real battle.
With a thunderous impact and a spray of blood, the first monster fell beneath their blows. From high in the mountains, an unseen observer judged the fight, while a tired but satisfied Chun Myung-hoon decided that his disciple had done enough. Grinning, Shubong asked the cat whether it feared for its prey, all while balancing a live rabbit on his head.
Before long, they were soaring over the vast and ancient monster lands. Shubion froze, staring into the heart of a deadly chase unfolding below. Then he recognized the mysterious rider racing through the forest battle. One predator bared its fangs and roared, eager to tear into its prey. The pack lunged at the rider as she clenched her teeth and prepared another strike. A young warrior drove his ostrich forward, lecturing her about a man's duty while impatiently waiting for the battle to begin. His path was suddenly blocked as a pack of wild Pirums surrounded him. The girl tried to draw some of them away, desperately calling the beasts toward herself to save Yulian. He began placing clever signal traps, complaining about the time they consumed while admitting how useful they were in the wilderness. She found Yulian asleep, and the moment he woke, he began trying to rescue her without giving her a chance to respond to his smug boasting. Then his gaze dropped to the enormous ruined pit below, and he realized with horror that he had damaged the very trap she had worked so hard to prepare. Orca exploded in anger, explaining how difficult it had been to gather so many intelligent, cautious creatures in one place. Orca remained skeptical and reminded him that they had already tried this approach, only to discover that the clever Rions could not be fooled so easily. When she demanded to know what he planned to do differently, Yulian claimed he had a trick that would make the beasts fall, even if they understood the danger.
Meanwhile, Chun Myung-hoon eagerly anticipated a feast, remarking that the beasts looked like domestic dogs, and that it had been far too long since he had tasted dog meat. The starving Rions caught the scent and charged, instinct overpowering caution. Yulian was baffled. Hunger should have weakened them, yet it seemed only to make them more vicious.
Yulian's eyes widened, and a stunned cry escaped him. There were not merely many enemies. There were a terrifying, impossible number of them. His gaze swept frantically across the battlefield as he searched for any path of escape.
He remembered earlier battles in which even 5 of these beasts had posed a mortal threat. Now, there were more than he could count. Every swing of his blade killed, yet more creatures poured in without end, trapping him at the center of a storm of claws and snarling jaws. A massive beast broke from the horde and lunged, its mouth wide enough to swallow him whole. Even a crushing counterattack brought no relief. The pack did not then, but continued to grow. Every movement drained his strength as the battlefield dissolved into chaos, pain, and destruction.
Another impact suddenly thundered across the field, pinning a beast to the ground, and it had not come from Yulian. A reckless frontal charge brought only another instant of terror before certain death. The enemy pack leader roared, trying to rally its weakened followers for one final assault.
The remaining giants charged, but Yulian drew his enormous blade and plunged into the heart of the battle. Leaping onto the back of his beast, rider and mount became a single lethal force. The red flag was already visible ahead. The decisive line was finally within reach.
His powerful companion, a swift beast armed with fearsome fangs, cleared every obstacle and carried them closer to the point of no return. Far below, hungry predators tore their prey apart in the darkness, leaving no chance of escape.
Yulian smirked, knowing the narrow gorge would force his enemies to attack one at a time instead of surrounding him. His massive blade was ready for a deadly dance, and he welcomed the chance to carve through anything that dared challenge him. Beasts flew aside beneath the force of his attacks, their silhouettes vanishing into clouds of dust.
Yulian hurled his enemies into the abyss and smugly accepted Orca's praise. Their familiar banter quickly turned into an argument over just how strong he had become. Then a monstrous roar silenced them both. The legendary sand dragon stood before them. Yulian clenched his fists and refused to acknowledge his fear. The ground split open beneath them, nearly swallowing Orca in the widening chasm. Before either of them could react, the monster struck, hurling Orca away and knocking Yulian off balance. The blade struck the parched ground with a dull thud, throwing up a cloud of choking dust. Panic seized Orca as cold sweat ran down his temples and the full weight of his helplessness before death closed in. Then an explosion hurled him into the air, tearing him away from his sword, and a commanding voice barked, "Boy!"
Orca recovered just in time. He was back on his feet with his sword in hand, facing the magnificent smoke-breathing beast. Another sudden blow sent him flying, and the same stern voice rang out once more. Orca begged for a demonstration, but received only sarcastic instruction that exposed how little he understood about the true nature of strength.
Gravity took hold, and the enormous log plunged toward the ground while the master watched the point of impact without blinking. Yet instead of shattering, the timber stopped beneath his palm, as though he had absorbed every trace of its momentum in an instant. When the disciple protested that he was not mentally prepared, Chun Myung-hoon cut off every excuse and reminded him that battle offered no such mercy.
The killing blow rushed toward him, its shadow swallowing everything below. Defying the danger, Yulian launched a counterattack, his sword carving a lethal spiral through the air. With a victorious grin, he reminded his enemy that true strength revealed itself only in real combat.
The monster suddenly vanished underground with terrifying speed, leaving Yulian momentarily stunned. It continued attacking from beneath the earth, forcing him to evade one deadly strike after another. Horror entered his eyes when he finally understood the scale of the trap. The ground split open and swallowed him in an instant. His sword shrieked against the rock, slowing his fall but never stopping it. With every passing second, despair grew stronger as he realized he had neither light nor any sense of direction. A sinister howl rose from the depths, and Yulian understood that he was not alone. Two bright points of light pierced the darkness, revealing a strange rabbit-like creature. At last, face to face with the source of his troubles, he immediately complained about the magic stones. But in that moment, any help was welcome. If death was inevitable, what difference did it make whose paws held the gems? A spark of hope returned to Yulian's eyes when the strange creature showed him a way forward. A distant light shimmered ahead, promising escape and filling him with exhilaration. Yet instead of freedom, he found himself falling once again, clawing desperately for life at the edge of another abyss. A wondrous new world opened before him, an untouched valley filled with creatures he had never seen. Far above, Chun Myung-hoon realized with irritation that he had missed the beginning of the spectacle. As if confirming his concern, the silhouette of an enormous creature emerged from the forest, radiating overwhelming power.
Deep down, Yulian was grateful for the companion who shared this perilous journey. Then he realized that he had entered the northern region of the monster lands, where the creatures surpassed even his wildest expectations. In the next instant, one fluffy animal vanished into the claws of a Purim, which calmly began chewing its prey.
Yulian understood in horror that these were not ordinary Purims, but merciless predators in a land where herbivores had no place. One beast's death cry ended beneath another monster's teeth. The gigantic hunter stood triumphant among the bodies, ravenous and utterly without mercy. The monster continued its bloody harvest in the distance, while Yulian gritted his teeth and realized the fight was far from over. Damn it, that didn't work, he thought, as the beast trapped him alone. Its enormous jaws snapped shut and swallowed both him and his sword into complete darkness. Inside the creature's mouth, Yulian struggled to free his damaged blade and prepare one final strike. Every movement was measured, every attack aimed at killing the beast from within. Then he slammed into a tree trunk. The impact was brutal, but not fatal. The crash shook the air and made the trees tremble. Driven mad by pain and rage, the monster launched one last attack. Yulian's body struck the ground hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. The giant collapsed among the broken trees, and Yulian had barely registered his victory before his strength began to fail. Even standing was almost impossible, but the thought of his unfinished revenge would not let him die. Leaning on his faithful horse, he disappeared into the darkness of the forest.
An elderly traveler discovered the aftermath of the savage battle and understood that the ancient monsters were abandoning their territories for a reason. Elsewhere, Chun Myung-hoon continued his own struggle for survival, defying death again and again.
It was more than simple assistance. It was ancient magic transforming his companion. Even when danger seemed distant, Chun Myung-hoon never relaxed, sensing its approach. Then the earth shook, and something ancient and colossal emerged from the depths of the forest. The ground blurred beneath pounding hooves, and every second seemed endless. A devastating strike tore a thunderous roar from the ancient creature. Its body became a falling shadow, descending with crushing speed. The blow landed across the beast's back and shook the ground. The monster roared as black fluid poured from its flesh, heralding its death. Yet its murderous gaze remained fixed on its target, promising that the danger was not over. The terrible impact left a gaping, scarlet wound in the earth. The huge spiked monster finally collapsed. Its body sprawled amid the smoking ruin. Land, water, and forest offered no peace, only an endless procession of deadly battles against creatures born from darkness. The master watched from a branch, confident that his disciple would prevail. But a gigantic shark nearly tore the young warrior apart. Bleeding heavily, Yulian still rose and launched one final attack. Chun Myung-hoon did not interfere. This enemy was part of the trial Yulian had to finish alone. Far away beneath the burning sun, a camp spread across the desert. A place where time followed ancient laws. Yulian gave a bitter smile and muttered, "The Empire. Always the Empire." It was no longer merely a personal desire, but a destiny shaped by strength and by Hen's unrivaled abilities. Elsewhere, a small figure stood at the foot of an ancient colossal statue, a monument to forgotten deeds. It seemed that the time of his return, and of great change, had finally come again. The entire group, led by Chun Myung-hoon, set out toward whatever awaited them at home. In the ruins of another world, a man appeared with a face hollowed by grief. Yulian knelt beside an infant whose tears reflected the despair surrounding them.
The baby's cries pierced the silence and announced yet another inevitable loss. Ash settled over the remains of once mighty walls, leaving only bitterness behind. Then the warrior held out his hand to Shubian and promised to become his father, the new pillar of a life already shattered. Years later, death came again for those who had sheltered Shubian, and once more he stood beside a dying guardian. Cruel voices whispered that the child was cursed, and that anyone who dared love him would die. His training remained merciless. Even blindfolded, Shubian was forced to feel the razor-thin boundary between life and death.
Still, he continued training, trying to drown the pain in his heart with every blow. His movements grew swift and deadly, and each exchange carried the promise of decisive victory, or defeat. As an adult, Shubian pushed through his fear and charged into mortal danger. The mighty axe passed into legend, his body reduced to fuel for a funeral pyre, while his soul vanished into the unknown beneath the mourner's eyes. Then Egan looked around and realized with alarm that the child at the center of the gathering had disappeared. Alone before a pack of predators, Shubian nearly surrendered to his old fear. But the memory of his father reminded him that the only thing worse than cowardice was lying to himself. Shouting, "I am not a coward!" he tightened his grip on his axe and charged the monsters. Chun Myung-hoon merely smirked as the fearless warrior delivered his first strike. The killing blow landed, and the sound of splitting flesh echoed across the field. Confusion gave way to curiosity as everyone demanded to know where Shubian had been, and he raised the trophy that proved he had finally come of age. Returning with his trophies, Yulian announced that he intended to undertake the journey of life and death and follow the path of his father. Chun Myung-hoon warned him that no one had dared attempt it in 30 years, and that even Valtion had failed to complete it. Yulian's resolve did not waver. After long deliberation, the supreme warrior allowed Yulian to begin the journey of life and death. Years of trials hardened the young man, and one day he returned to the elder and declared himself ready for the final ceremony. Now he had to prove that the road he had traveled had truly made him a warrior. While Yulian made his way home, Orca Provoke sought solitude and bristled at anyone who disturbed it. As he sank into deep meditation, intricate patterns of energy formed around him. Even in silence, he continued searching for a power that brute force alone could never provide. Orca saw endless majesty in the natural world, but his visitors quickly dragged him back to practical concerns. With a mocking smile, He asked whether their great dream amounted to nothing more than eating well and living comfortably until death. Chun Myung-hoon only smiled, recognizing the worry hidden beneath the sarcasm. Tired of vague conversation, Orca demanded to know why they had come. At that moment, his attention shifted to Yulian, who was lifting colossal stone blocks with ease during training. Every impact against the ground showed just how far the young warrior had advanced. After much hesitation, the elder accepted Yulian's decision and blessed his participation in the warrior initiation ceremony. The young man understood how dangerous the path would be, but believed the trial was necessary. To him, it was not an act of pride, but the fulfillment of a duty.
Elsewhere in the settlement, children were splashing happily in the river when a grown Yulian appeared before them. He joked with the boys and told stories of his travels, but his thoughts soon returned to what mattered most. After so long away, more than anything, he wanted to see his mother.
At last he stood before her, and her warm smile and peaceful gaze were all the proof he needed that he was home. Then, without warning, a powerful strike tore through the air and shook the ground. His teacher only smirked, seeing the same insolent boy as before, and followed with another resounding blow. The master's words hurt more than his fists, confirming a bitter truth. 3 years had passed, and Yulian still could not match him. Victory burned in the young man's eyes as he imagined Chun Myung-hoon as a sand dragon that had to be defeated at any cost. Aruk surged at the master like a whirlwind, while Yulian shouted and charged beside him. Even their combined efforts could not break the old master's overwhelming power, and another thunderous impact rang out. Smiling, Chun Myung-hoon asked Orca to share the burden of hunting, and she readily agreed. He explained that defeating even one such dragon had been difficult, and that he possessed only 3 crystals, prompting Orca to ask in alarm whether he had entered the monster lands alone. Chun Myung-hoon chided Orca for worrying too much for a future chief, and asked whether the lives of the tribe's warriors meant nothing to her. A sword gleamed in a tightly clenched hand, announcing that battle was near. Tension hardened every feature, but an unbreakable will still burned in those eyes.
Young Pair boldly challenged his elder brother and finally forced him to respond. In the midst of anger and desperation, Yulian announced his decision to take part in the warrior initiation. Farewells came from every direction as the tribe wished him luck and a safe return, and he entrusted his mother to his younger brother's care. When their mother learned about Pair's supposedly important business, she could not hide her anger or confusion. His sudden appearance interrupted the conversation, and though deeply worried, she acknowledged the intelligence and strength he kept hidden. Tormented by fear, she begged him to turn back, but Pair Provoke asked only for her blessing on the deadly road ahead.
Meanwhile, his elder brother Yulian prepared for an ordeal no less dangerous. Chun Myung-hoon bluntly reminded him that the journey could kill him, yet Yulian trusted his master's strength as absolute protection. Only then did he truly understand his mother's fear. Many who took this path never returned. Chun Myung-hoon, however, had complete faith that his disciple would survive every trial. After an exhausting journey, they finally reached a fortress city shrouded in ancient mystery. Irritated by unseen watchers, the master threatened to tear out the eyes of anyone who dared spy on them.
The argument with the uninvited guests increasingly tested Chun Myung-hoon's patience. He was not accustomed to obeying another person's orders. A piercing cry from the Fennec Direk suddenly ended the exchange and put everyone on alert. Yulian watched in silence, trying to understand what new danger the little beast had sensed. Their path led toward the gates of a temple steeped in ancient mystery. Chun Myung-hoon confirmed Yulian's concern by admitting that he had a bad feeling. They learned that the neutral Pareia Tribe oversaw the initiation ceremony, and that any outside interference would compromise the fairness of the trial.
Chun Myung-hoon met the calm gaze of an elder who guarded ancient secrets. A young woman named Lacrimosa was assigned to guide the newcomers, and she warned them of the place's highest law. Conflict between tribes was punishable by death. During the coming ceremony, old rivalries could easily end in execution. A shout rose from the crowd announcing Shubian's arrival, and Yulian watched him with interest. 2 more figures observed their conversation from the shadows, their purpose still hidden. Yulian argued with relentless logic that a true chief had to be more than powerful. He also had to be wise and cautious. He addressed the legendary Shubin, the warrior known as the Undying One, whose return had shaken the entire tribe. Orca suddenly looked around and asked, "Where is Perry?" Then the fight began. A sharp thrust answered by an instant sidestep. Orca slipped away from the attack in a blur of motion as his own blade struck the ground with a clang. With a savage cry, the fighter charged again and brought his sword down with crushing force. Orca's eyes narrowed, tracking every detail of the assault.
Orca ended the duel with one devastating blow, but he had no intention of forgiving an insult to the tribe. When young Slav Venersis stepped into the conflict, he called for an end to the violence and offered to defend the defeated side's honor himself. His name alone was enough to make the crowd whisper about the strength he concealed.
Orca accepted Slav Venersis' challenge, and the two warriors prepared for another duel. Nearby, however, a different and stranger ritual had begun. A mysterious man cast dice and addressed Yulian. His request that the young chief choose a number from 1 to 6 sounded like the opening move of a dangerous game. One warrior suddenly shouted, "4!" But the stranger coldly silenced him and demanded an answer from the young chief alone. Surprise crossed Yulian's face as the man's outline blurred, as if he were dissolving into the air. A scream of terror shattered the silence and announced that disaster had already begun. One warrior collapsed, writhing in agony, while his companions demanded to know what had happened. Elsewhere, a strange companion yawned openly and clung to someone for protection, leaving everyone bewildered. One fighter raised his axe and refused to let an insult pass, while another urged restraint, aware that the growing conflict could end in slaughter. Orca suddenly appeared above the center of the arena and commanded everyone to stop. Then another mysterious figure emerged from the shadows like a ghost, and the force of that presence extinguished the rising hostility at once. A silent threat hung over the fallen warriors, promising immediate punishment for anyone who challenged the rules again.
The inquiry revealed that no one had actually witnessed the attack, leaving the accusation against Yulian on uncertain ground. Orca decided to punish only those who had first approached the victim, but Yulian voluntarily shared his companion's blame. The rest of his group agreed to accept the consequences with him.
As the participants prepared for the ceremony, the elders debated Locri's controversial decisions and the presence of imperial knights. Remaining impartial was becoming increasingly difficult, and the old trial was unsuitable for the hundreds who had gathered. The council therefore changed the first stage, intending to show the outsiders the desert's true cruelty. Far from those discussions, an unknown young man lay unconscious and forgotten on the floor, his fate shrouded in mystery. This warrior, once said to rival even the god of war, had vanished without a trace and left behind only legends. A sudden cry of alarm broke the silence and drew every eye toward him. Yulian fixed the stranger with a piercing stare and demanded to know where he came from. His father had taught him that a warrior's strength lay not only in the sword, but also in the mind, urging him to read and learn by example. The discussion grew increasingly tense and strategic. Should they remain and wait, or move first and meet the inevitable battle head-on?
The true price of their punishment was finally announced, 60 points, to be earned through a collective effort that would atone for their guilt and restore their honor. The prince dismissed every possible threat with shameless condescension, calling the other tribes worthless and remaining blind to the deadly resolve driving them. His performance on the battlefield bordered on farce. He waved his arms and shouted, while his so-called enemies inexplicably dropped to their knees and surrendered.
With every clumsy movement and theatrical cry, it became clear that the real battle was taking place somewhere far from this staged victory. Then Yulian pointed toward one of the trainees and asked whether Hombok had ever possessed such a skilled warrior. Chun Myung-hoon revealed the answer. The man was Luke, the only knight able to wield a mysterious force. Chaos consumed the field, but Chun never looked away as he judged every movement. Two assassins attacked Chun Myung-hoon at the same time, but the old master caught a blade and threw both men aside with one motion. While they struggled to recover, Yulian entered a battle of his own. Two fights unfolded in parallel, and both demanded absolute precision. Yulian quickly brought down several opponents and believed for a moment that the fight was over. Then one enemy rose again, and Chun Myung-hoon noticed another hidden threat. Deadly projectiles tore through the air, forcing Yulian to leap clear of their path. The enemy was cunning, and another attack followed before Yulian could recover. A lethal projectile passed within inches of his head and buried itself in the ground. Orha Provoke reacted at the last possible moment, using her bow to deflect the return strike and escape certain injury.
With an almost playful smile, Yulian watched Orha spin away and vanish in a single leap. Chun Myung-hoon insisted that they had wasted a chance to eliminate a serious threat, but Yulian only smiled, lost in thoughts of the cute archer.
Elsewhere, Orha Provoke sat alone in deep thought, surrounded by a forest as silent as she was. A young warrior admitted that he hated being called a child, and the fury in his eyes made that hatred feel deadly. A lightning-fast block was followed by a series of attacks so swift and precise that few warriors could have performed them. Deep cuts twisted the guard's face with pain and terror. At last, the missing man was found. A young warrior hauled the sleeping beauty upright, while Yulian frowned and wondered where Trikel had disappeared to. Birds scattered in panic as deadly blades whistled straight toward him. A sudden strike pierced his arm and knocked him off balance, pain swallowing his senses for a heartbeat. Trikel immediately drove off the ground and vaulted into the air to evade the next attack. The following blow was powerful enough to shake the trees and hurl a battered enemy from the shadows. After Trikel won the fight, the warriors around him mocked the uselessness of their woodpecker. Meanwhile, the Matipi warriors, led by Hibaina, spotted projectiles flying toward them, one of which struck the ground with perfect accuracy. Thorn-covered vines erupted from below, wrapped around the tribe's fighters, and paralyzed them with the power of the earthworms. Spectral bears crashed into the remaining warriors and battered their defenses. Instead of counterattacking, Hibaina suddenly turned and fled, leaving his enemy confused. With a gentle smile, the wise elder Chun Myung-hoon said he was willing to listen before stating his own position. Blades whistled through the air as the fighter parried his pursuers with lightning speed. Hibaina clutched his head when a sudden pain struck him, while Trikel argued that no one obeyed the rules anyway, making it easy to dispose of an irritating opponent. One of Hibaina's companions stared in disbelief as his leader abruptly doubled over. Mysterious blows immobilized the warriors before they could draw their swords, stunning even Orca. After the brutal stage, only 245 competitors remained. The Shuaruri tribe had gained the greatest advantage, while Yulian greeted his score of 32 points with a brazen smile. "Just a few minor clashes along the way," Yulian explained casually. Orca sternly replied that a disciple of Chun Myung-hoon could hardly have done otherwise. Failure would simply have gotten him killed. Night settled over the mountains, promising a long and bitter cold, while Yulian's eyes reflected the certainty that something fateful was approaching. A gigantic raven appeared above the camp, and its spreading shadow took on a human form. Chun Myung-hoon emerged from the darkness in a mysterious mask, and announced that he had come to speak with Yulian. The old man knew more about sacred beasts, hidden orders, and the secrets of the Saya tribe than any ordinary warrior. It was almost unheard of for a creature so ancient and powerful to choose an ordinary mortal with no visible strength as its master. Chun Myung-hoon interrupted the young man and revealed the true purpose of his visit. He had an important proposal for Yulian. Then came the monstrous truth. He intended to feed Shaturapik's power to another being and raise that creature to unimaginable heights. Orca immediately ended the negotiations and ordered the visitors out, declaring that such a dishonorable plan had no place in his home. Chun Myung-hoon, wild-haired and burning-eyed, began explaining the sacred animal's true nature. 7 principles had been carved into stone, among them patience, sacrifice for one's companions, unbreakable resolve, and absolute trust. Some doubted whether the 4th principle, sacrificing oneself for others, could truly be followed when immortal glory was at stake. One warrior demanded to know what kind of trial treated food as more important than anything else, arguing that no one could win without strength. Chun Myung-hoon calmly explained that fasting purified the blood, sharpened the mind, and ultimately revealed the spirit's true power. The rules were surprisingly simple, yet as ominous as the land in which they would have to survive. Under no circumstances were they allowed to kill anyone. Then the sky suddenly darkened, making Yulian look up in confusion. A tremendous impact seemed to split the heavens and shattered the silence with rolling thunder. The scarce supplies could not feed everyone, and several powerful fighters decided to claim them for themselves. Tension quickly became an open challenge, but Gahan al-Ramucha of the Pareia Tribe met the threats with frightening calm. His quiet reply sounded more dangerous than any battle cry.
More fighters moved to join Gahan's opponents, but another warrior carrying an equally enormous weapon unexpectedly diffused the confrontation. Instead of wasting blood in a pointless fight, he proposed that they unite and leave the disputed supplies to those who needed them most. Thus the warriors of Dapur entered the camp, choosing disciplined strength over reckless cruelty.
Yulian explained why he had refused to fight over food. The supplies would not have fed even a fifth of the group. Rather than spill blood for nothing, he suggested hunting beyond the barrier, then declared that the tribe should unite against the kingdom's rule. That night, the warriors set out to hunt and prepare for the trials ahead. Powerful beasts fell before the united tribes, revealing their growing strength and coordination. A distant metallic crack cut through the night and echoed across the mountains like an omen. With a furious shout, Tahan tried to break through the defense, launching sharp attacks that rang against steel. A powerful shove sent Tahan sprawling in the dust, his scraped face showing the ferocity of the duel. Smiling like a victor, he offered a hand and explained that his skill came not only from training, but from a unique, hellish method. Yulian watched with a sharp, determined gaze and promised himself he would miss nothing.
The opponent began to fade, dissolving into the air. A blow landed cleanly, but the body only flashed and vanished. Among the spectators stood more than warriors, and the arrival of those unfamiliar figures deepened the mystery surrounding the place.
Rage erupted as the outsider's leader charged while his companions struggled to restrain a trembling opponent. Shapes of monsters emerged from the darkness and froze the enemy ranks with fear. Then Yulian struck with crushing force, making it clear that his patience was over. A sharp blow smashed into the enemy's face and drowned him in pain. Obsessed with the distance he still had to close, Orca refined every strike in pursuit of perfection. Each movement became sharper, every swing more precise, as he searched through battle for the road to true power. The opponent fell and the path opened, but it was only a small victory on a much longer road. A headbanded warrior calmly announced that 84 people had passed, then warned that anyone wishing to abandon the third stage had to decide before it began. The powers they had witnessed were not natural gifts of the Sad Tribe, but blessings of the gods of storm and war that only the tribe knew how to bestow. A sudden memory unsettled Orca. The powerful warrior had once told him to rest, as though such kindness were perfectly natural. Those simple words made him think about things long forgotten beneath battle and survival. He and his companion exchanged a look of grim realization. Time was running out.
Amid the confusion, voices called for the others to be warned before it was too late. Several warriors agreed that the contest was individual and that only one person could become the victor, even if many reached the finish. Then determination flared in one man's eyes as he accepted the truth and reached again for the source of knowledge.
Once again, surrounded by endless volumes, Chun Myung-hoon searched for the path, destiny, and mission that had brought him there. Then a thunderous voice announced the third trial. The warriors had 1 month to reach the temple by following a trail of arrows. Orca explained that he refused to leave future generations nothing but blood-soaked ruins and a dead desert. Orca's true nature finally emerged. He was no pacifist, but he was willing to lead a massacre if it served a greater purpose. At the same time, the danger revealed its own face and stunned even the most experienced warriors. They found themselves trapped inside a sinister maw that seemed to devour the light itself. Treasures lay beneath the devastation. A hero's sword and a cup once held by ancient kings, both buried beneath the weight of time. Far away stood a secluded temple, guarding secrets centuries old. Even there, however, the earth began to move, and a watchful eye immediately detected the approaching threat. A mysterious envoy emerged from the frozen mist, resembling a sinister puppet with a burning heart hidden inside its chest. 5 warriors formed a circle and prepared for battle as dark power spiraled around the creature. Though still restrained, Chun Myung-hoon began loosening his hands and muttered about some brat who was probably cursing him behind his back, promising to deal with him later. A blinding blade of concentrated light burst from the darkness. Everyone froze as something shifted above them, but their hesitation lasted only a moment. Desperate attacks passed uselessly through the mist, proving that it was intangible and utterly unnatural. Like cornered animals, the warriors rushed into the magic circle, though even their final refuge seemed dangerously fragile. Yulian made a fateful decision. He would charge into the mist and scatter it with the power of the wind, giving the others a chance to survive. He summoned every remaining trace of strength and drew the currents of darkness into one devastating strike.
Chun Myung-hoon saw what Yulian intended and understood the danger his disciple was accepting. The others, exhausted by the battle, could barely breathe as they watched the final exchange unfold.
With one last desperate burst, Yulian tore himself from the center of the destruction. His technique tightened the space around the enemy into a deadly snare. Reaching through the raging currents of energy, he struggled to grasp the person still trapped in danger. A violent vortex erupted from his hands and plunged into the heart of the chaos, attempting to stop the destruction. One final impact shook the very fabric of reality and promised to decide the battle. At last, a colossal explosion shook the earth and left only smoking ruins behind. A mentor, terrified for her disciple's life, refused to accept the outcome and clung to her responsibility to protect him. Chun Myung-hoon, however, stared into the chaos with unwavering resolve and saw only the highest test of spirit, the perfection of battle. A quiet gasp escaped the woman when she understood the scale of the storm approaching them. After surviving the deadly trap, Yulian and his companions could barely remain standing. Poison still ate away at their bodies, and Chun Myung-hoon admitted that he could use only half of his strength. Only Yulian's protective circle had allowed the group to survive the toxic mist and reach temporary shelter. Orca's condition deteriorated rapidly, and Chun Myung-hoon confirmed the worst. The poison was still destroying him from within. Medicine could slow the ancient forbidden curse for only a short time. Realizing that the mist had been a carefully prepared trap, Orca swore to find the culprit before his strength disappeared completely.
4 enemy warriors prepared to attack with cold, merciless focus. There would be no delay, only a swift and brutal death. Under a storm of blows, Chun Myung-hoon spun a massive shield and deflected one killing blade after another, while another assault descended from above. His enemies answered only with sneers, savoring his pain and offering him the pathetic choice between death and humiliating surrender.
He became a furious vortex of steel, forcing the attackers back for a precious moment. Every movement carved through the air with lethal precision. One enemy stood apart from the others, watching with casual arrogance, before apparently deciding to spare the country bumpkin he had been mocking.
Faced with the warriors of the Inama kingdom, the group realized that a direct battle would end in disaster and retreated into the forest. The wounded could barely keep moving, and time was against them. Elsewhere, the Fennec Derrick sensed an approaching visitor, and soon a masked man with a raven on his shoulder appeared at Orca's door. The meeting did not remain peaceful for long. The pet hissed furiously at the raven, warning of a hidden conflict. A young woman named Halai anxiously admitted that she had made a mistake without yet understanding the true scale of the threat. Terror entered the eyes of both her and Chun Myung-hoon when they realized that the fragile peace had already been shattered.
A sudden assault threw the camp into chaos. Cries of "Enemies!" split the night as a rain of arrows fell on the unsuspecting warriors. The commander ordered everyone to hold formation and prepare for an ambush, only to discover that Halai had vanished into the darkness. Yulian, by contrast, remained so calm that he decided to sleep, leaving his subordinates with one final warning: stay alert and do nothing foolish. Orca threw a blade at the captive Chun Myung-hoon and challenged him without hesitation. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the warrior only laughed and forbade anyone else from interfering. Their swords collided, turning the duel into a swift and deadly dance. The force of their clash hurled both fighters apart, but an order to retreat interrupted the duel. Chun Myung-hoon noticed a hidden danger in the forest and chose to withdraw his group, unleashing one last wave of power before leaving. As he vanished among the trees, he promised Orca they would meet again, a threat wrapped in a compliment. As Orca recovered, she privately acknowledged her opponent's incredible strength, despite his obvious madness. Yulian remained calm, diffused the immediate threat, and proposed an unexpected alliance instead of another battle. Orca only smirked and cited an ancient law, which Yulian immediately challenged as an outdated prejudice. In a distant sanctuary, light shimmered mysteriously above a ceremonial cup as a young priestess burst in and shattered the silence. She wondered how the appearance of a new chosen one might alter fate, and insisted that the poisonous mist had not been an accident. Later, the group debated the enemy's proposal, dismissed it as a calculated deception, and ultimately sided with the young glow. With no time left to hesitate, he cast aside his doubts and made a difficult decision. Chun Myung-hoon assured the others that he still possessed the strength to endure, but those who could see his true condition were not convinced. They left him with reluctance, trusting his word despite their fear, and continued on without him. His solitude ended abruptly when Chun Myung-hoon sensed uninvited visitors approaching. Time was running out. While he fought the enemy within his own body, the enemies outside prepared to strike, knowing that every passing minute could allow him to recover. Their sinister laughter spread through the air as bloodlust twisted their faces and promised a merciless assault. Moments later, Chun Myung-hoon stood before a ring of armed opponents who attacked from every side without giving him a breath. Their eyes were filled with grim resolve, and every weapon was raised to kill. Elsewhere, a ruthless warning was delivered. Once all strength was exhausted, only death remained, and Orca watched with pain and fear. The warrior learned to turn his massive blade into an extension of his will, using it to stop attacks that once would have killed him. His speed and precision had grown, and every counter now carried a threat his enemies had not expected. Even 3 opponents were no longer beyond him. He changed positions, evaded, and struck back with rapidly improving skill. Surrounded by enemies, Yulian used an unusual technique that conserved his strength while confusing his attackers. They soon realized that he was buying time and prepared a coordinated strike. At the critical moment, Yulian remembered Chun Myung-hoon's lesson. Genuine power would always triumph over illusion. A shrill whistle pierced the sky as a storm of arrows descended on the battlefield. 4 powerful warriors used their mystic abilities to stop the volley, creating whirlwinds and shields of flame. Their leading archer released several arrows at once, each carrying enough force to kill. Their impatience turned to relief when the leader finally appeared with a massive shield on his back, and his arrival was acknowledged with a restrained but meaningful glance. Yulian, his eyes cold with fury, delivered a sentence severe enough to sober even the fearless. Then, an unseen voice announced the end of the 3rd trial, and declared that only the prepared had endured long enough to understand its true purpose. The 4th trial, the trial of silence, would begin in 12 hours, under the supervision of a mysterious priestess, and anyone wishing to withdraw had to tell her. Elsewhere, a grinning entity rose from a shimmering sphere and foreshadowed new dangers. Other participants discussed one man's decision to leave, admitting that he had judged his strengths and weaknesses wisely, because his magic depended on his voice. Before the next trial, Yulian suggested that the group rest briefly, unaware of what awaited them. The organizers debated which competitors should be preserved for later stages, while the remaining participants gathered in a vast hall. When the countdown ended, everyone would be transported to a new trial zone, and Chun Myung-hoon urged his companions to stay together. Instead of an ordinary transfer, they were greeted by a horrifying vision: skulls floating in the air. An immense gateway blocked the path, Its arches formed from gigantic ribs that descended into an unknown abyss. Beneath that terrifying structure, other groups stood waiting, some already trembling at the threat ahead. One group after another, including several groups of women, entered the unknown with either determination or resignation. They vanished into the black passage leading to an entirely different world. Then a sharp sound cut through the silence, and everything plunged into overwhelming darkness.